Okay, if you used to listen to hard rock and heavy metal back in the 80s, or if you just kind of grew up in the 80s, teenager back then, I think you're going to enjoy this video. I found this really interesting article about something that we all kind of lived through back then, the craziness of music and how they were trying to put warning labels on albums and all that stuff. So I'm going to read this to you because I think you're going to find this really interesting. But before I do, what I've got here today is this Motley Crue album. This is Shout at the Devil. This came out in 1983. And hopefully you can see it in that camera, but it has that pentagram. I remember when this thing came out, and I remember seeing this in the stores. I was actually really excited for it to come out because I had been introduced to Motley Crue when I heard the song Livewire and Too Fast for Love, and I just fell in love with that. And when this album came out, I remember seeing this in the store, and it was just that black album cover, and it was just kind of eerie looking. And I remember buying it, and then you open it up, of course, and then you see that. And especially Mick Mars with that flame in the back. I mean, this was so intense. This was so intense. But the thing I wanted to point out today, as I talk about this and as I share this with you, is what's on the back. Because they did something really interesting. And again, this is 1983. And you can read there, right there in red, it says, "Caution, this album may contain backwards messages." Now, it's interesting that they put that on there because guess who decided that needed to be put on the album? The band did. The people that produced this album wanted that on there, not because there were backwards messages on the album, because they knew something. They knew that if they put something like that on there, it would sell records. We're going to put a warning label on our album because we know that that's going to get people interested in it. And of course, it did. And it was an interesting thing because at the time, there was all this stuff. You remember the whole thing about all the backwards messages people thought were on in the song Stairway to Heaven. And right here in the early 80s, boy, it was just exploding. You had all these different groups talking about the bad lyrics and the heavy metal music and all what it's going to do to ruin our children. And of course, the backwards messages and all the other awful messages that are coming from all the music, especially the heavy metal and hard rock at the time. And I remember going through this. I remember this as a kid because it was such it was just kind of everywhere. Seems like everybody was talking about it. You go to rock concerts and there'd be these pastors and evangelists standing outside with crosses, with these megaphones, reading the Bible, telling you not to go into it. And I remember just all the chaos related to this. And it was pretty interesting because then when 1985 rolled around, which is when this article popped up, and this is why I think you'll find this interesting. When 1985 popped up, a lady by the name of Tipper Gore, this was Al Gore's wife, created this organization called the PMRC, which was the Parent Music Resource Center. And the idea was to help parents understand the kind of horrible, awful music that their kids were listening to give them a warning. Now, I knock it today because as a teenager, I know how I felt about that stuff. But you look back and you think, what would I have thought, though, if I were a parent at the time? Because a lot of parents just didn't know what to do with it. This music was this heavy rock and roll and and bands that looked like this and bands that look like this. I mean, what are we supposed to do? Because my son now has these posters all over his wall, all this craziness and the loud music and the distorted guitars and these lyrics that I don't understand. And I don't know why, but my parents, interestingly, reacted in a way that I hope I would have reacted at the time, which was they just didn't do anything. They didn't worry about it. Maybe they did worry about it. I don't know, but they just kind of let me do my thing. I had all the posters on the wall. I was listening to all the crazy, awful music, on and on, but they just let it be. And as a result, we always had a great relationship. I never felt the need to rebel. But it was so interesting because the reason I bring this up is when you look at a band like Motley Crue putting a warning on their album intentionally, making it look like somebody else put the warning on there, but the reality of it is they're the ones that put it on there because they understood the psychological effect that something like this would have. And I'm not going to go into a sociological deep dive on this topic today, but it is an interesting thing when you look at this, because what a lot of these rock stars knew was that this actually was going to work to their benefit. And so I want to share this with you, and I want to get your feedback if you remember this time and what your experience with it was, especially what was your experience, looking back at it now as an adult, as in I'm a grandpa. Looking back at this now, when I was a teenager, what this experience was like and how adults, the people that were our age, what were they doing at the time and how they were reacting to this. Okay, so this is from October 17th, 1985 in the Syracuse Herald Journal. And of course, the picture there that they put on the top is Motley Crue right there, the worst of the worst. So, and it says, rock stars protest rating lyrics. Okay, the prediction, heavy metal music is dying, the victim of dismal record sales and fickle radio and video airplay. The controversy, rock music under attack by the 5 million member National Parent-Teacher Association and the so-called Washington Wives. The Parents Music Resource Center, that's the PMRC that I just mentioned a second ago, an organization that includes the wives of 10 U.S. senators, 6 congressmen, and a cabinet secretary. The organizations want pop record albums to carry labels warning parents about potentially offensive lyrics, broaching topics including sex, violence, and the occult, or encouraging the use of alcohol and drugs. The reality, heavy metal bands like Dio and Rat draw around 8,000 to the Onondaga County War Memorial for concerts in Syracuse this fall. Motley Crue, currently one of heavy metal's hottest bands, and with a song listed on the Parents Music Resource Center's Filthy 15, is expected to draw at least 5,000 to its War Memorial concert tonight. So, they created this thing called the Filthy 15. And what it was kind of like making an example of certain bands and certain songs. And on this list, one of the main groups on this list was Motley Crue, and it was a song from this album. And it was just an example of the kinds of things that parents need to be aware of that their children are listening to. And it's interesting looking back now and just look at this album cover. Why? Why would you make an album cover like this if it was so obviously for the purpose of upsetting people and getting attention? That's it. That was it. That was why they did it. And it's so interesting because they got the reaction they wanted. When you look at this, the reality of it is they got exactly what they were wanting to do. And when you look at this Filthy 15 group, and this is why it was kind of important for those of us that were into hard rock and heavy metal at the time, because the groups that were on this thing, although there were a few pop bands like Cyndi Lauper and Prince, most of it, more than half of it, were just these heavy metal bands. Like Judas Priest, Motley Crue, of course. You had AC/DC, Venom, Merciful Fate, and reality. I mean, Venom and Merciful Fate, as far as impact on the broader culture, very few people were paying attention to, let's be honest, Venom or Merciful Fate at the time. Twisted Sister, they were huge. Black Sabbath, Wasp, Def Leppard, those were actually big bands that were having a big impact. Anyway, those were the hard rock heavy metal bands that were on that list. And so you're gonna find this so interesting as I keep going. Despite those attendance figures, the outlaw brand of rock and roll is in trouble and under fire. MTV, the cable network devoted to rock and roll music, which was once a bastion of heavy metaldom, has cut back drastically on the number of heavy metal videos aired. Record companies this year have signed fewer heavy metal bands, and radio stations generally have been pickier about which heavy metal bands get airtime, mostly the big names like Motley Crue and Rat. Now, here's the deal. This prediction that heavy metal was going away was so wrong. I mean, they may have signed fewer bands, whatever, and sales on one particular year had gone down, but they just weren't even close to what was really, really happening in the world. It was maybe in some cases just wishful thinking that something was changing, because it wasn't. I mean, it was changing form. But I mean, right around the corner, Metallica is about to really start taking off. Guns N' Roses is about to become this massive thing, and all these different groups were just, and then within a year, Def Leppard is going to be one of the biggest selling bands ever. So, all right, so keep going. High attendance has been common for Motley Crue and Rat on their current concert tours. Their record sales and attendance figures defy the predictions of the death of heavy metal brought on by the writers who monitor rock and roll for a living. Quote, I would say more than they're dying, they're not coming up with good ideas for entertainment stories, Motley Crue guitarist Mick Mars said in a recent telephone interview from Houston. Mars and the rest of the Los Angeles-based Crue, drummer Tommy Lee, bassist Nikki Sixx, and lead vocalist Vince Neil, have the right to take on a thumb your nose at the establishment attitude. Their Theater of Pain LP is one of only 2 heavy metal albums certified platinum, sales over 1 million this year, and I believe the other one would have had to have been Rat's Invasion of Your Privacy. Check me on that. But I think if they're saying that only 2 albums were over 1 million that year, I believe Invasion of Your Privacy had 2 million. So that would have, I'm assuming that's the other album they're talking about here. Last year, 11 heavy metal albums reached that status, while 14 hit gold, 500,000 copies sold level. So they're basically saying, see, this year only 2 heavy metal albums reached over 1 million. Well, that was about to change anyway. Now here, this is where it really gets into the heart of this issue, as far as I'm concerned, and the broader sociological discussion that can happen about this. And we'll have to do this one of these days, get a group of people in here and talk about this, because it's so fascinating. Proud to be among Filthy 15, listen to this. And Crue members have few qualms about their place on the Filthy 15 chart created by the Parents Music Resource Center. Quote, we take that as a compliment, said Sixx. Now, Sixx, of course, they're talking about Nikki Sixx. If you didn't know this, Nikki Sixx was the brains behind Motley Crue. He was the main songwriter. He was the driving force visionary behind this group. I didn't realize that until much, much later. I just thought he was just the bassist. So for those of you that don't know, that are watching this, that's Nikki Sixx right there. He was the main guy. And then that's Mick Mars, the one they were quoting a second ago. This is Tommy Lee, the one that kind of everybody in the world knows who. He kind of became really infamous over the years, all the different women that he dated and et cetera, et cetera. And then there's Vince Neil. But listen to that though. Nikki Sixx says, what did he say? This is why this is so interesting. We take that as a compliment. So what Nikki Sixx understood very clearly, and why you see an album cover like this, is he knew if he was smart about this from a business standpoint, is you do the things that are going to make parents angry, because you're going to get attention. And if you can do anything you can to get attention, you're going to have bigger sales and you're going to make more money. And I saw an interview with Nikki Sixx years and years and years after this. And it was funny because he was kind of reminiscing back on this period of time. And he actually said something in this interview. He said, wait a minute, are you telling me you're going to put a warning label on our records? Thank you. Because he understood that. You slap a warning label on a record, and what's the first thing the kids are going to want to get? The one with the warning label. Of course, obviously. I mean, we're just kind of wired that way. And so then when you look at this right here, this was so smart from a business standpoint. Let's put warnings on our records. He was doing this a couple of years before this organization even existed, for the purpose of trying to get attention, trying to stir things up, trying to get, again, kids like me to go buy it. And guess what? I did. And millions of other people did too. Motley Crue has a history of songs with lyrics that may make parents do double takes at their children's stereos, if they can understand the words above the din of wailing guitars. Take the song Livewire from the album Too Fast for Love, which includes this verse, and then they read a couple of the lyrics from that song. By the way, oh yeah, and this is the song I was mentioning earlier. I remember where I was when I first heard the song Livewire. That is, to this day, is one of the most brutal, amazing hard rock / heavy metal songs ever recorded. That guitar riff, that hook. And matter of fact, when I was a kid, here's the thing. When I was a kid and I was listening to that song, number one, I could barely understand what Vince Neil was saying. Number two, I had no idea what it meant. All I knew is it was just this really awesome energy. And it just felt cool. And I loved listening to it. And for a bunch of kids, I remember I was outside in somebody's backyard playing football with a Nerf football with a bunch of guys, and somebody had a boombox and they threw Live Wire on. And all I know is you hear that song and you're like, whoa, and then you just feel energy. And it's just exciting and it's fun and it's loud and it's obnoxious and it just feels great for like a 12-year-old boy. It was perfect. And I didn't know what the words meant. And so again, when you look back at this, you had all these parents that were sometimes reading things into what was going on and overreacting to it. Okay, continuing on. And from the new album comes Tonight We Need a Lover, and not so thinly veiled effort Sixx calls one of the sleaziest songs ever written. Okay, so that song's on Theater of Pain, of course. Is it one of the sleaziest songs ever written? No. But Nikki Sixx sure wants you to think so. Obviously, it's the same thing. It's marketing. It's doing everything you can to get attention. And Nikki Sixx was brilliant handling these things the way he did. And so many people in the industry were doing the same thing, because here you have these guys, with the makeup and all this other stuff and the pentagram and anything they can do to just bother people. And because they knew, again, it was going to sell records. Okay, continuing on here. But band members are also quick to point out their songs that are simple love ballads like Home Sweet Home, or with an uplifting social message like Fight for Your Rights, an homage, says writer Sixx, to Martin Luther King Jr. Mars said groups like Motley Crue offer a positive force for the bands and are strongly opposed to the labeling of record albums. Consequently, and now this is, who knows what was really said and who really said it. This is what they're saying Mick Mars said. But again, like I said, Nikki Sixx is looking at this like, man, this is what's going to sell albums for us. Consequently, they're not so pleased with efforts by the Parents Music Resource Center that culminated in Senate hearings last month. Some agree with former Eagle Glenn Frey, who calls the effort a witch hunt. Quote, "I'd like to see those old bags take a Benny Goodman album, spin it backwards and hear any satanic message," says Cruise Mars. "It can be a weird thing when you spin an album backward. You can hear anything," unquote. It's interesting, on one of the videos we did, a couple weeks ago, it was an interview with Jimmy Page, and it was a written interview like these things. And they asked him that question about Stairway to Heaven and the backwards messages on that. And his response was, ask Robert Plant. He wrote the words. He says, but, when I was a kid, I spent my time listening to records forward so I could learn how to play the guitar. If I spent all my time listening to them backwards, I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing right now. Anyway, just kind of an interesting thing. Like, this is so ridiculous. You people are playing like backwards. Are you serious? So then, of course, a couple of bands actually intentionally put some backwards things on their records, just because. So anyway, it's kind of interesting. Quote, "They missed the point about something," says Dave Meniketti, lead guitarist for Y&T, which is touring with Motley Crue. "Most people don't listen to lyrics half the time. Ask 100 people what a song said and you'll get 100 different answers. It's just the beat, the mood of a song that appeals to most people," unquote. Meniketti is concerned, boy, do you remember Y&T? That guy had one of the most amazing voices. I love Dave Meniketti. Guy was just so great. His voice is so great. Meniketti is concerned with the Parents Music Resource Center is picking out, quote, smutty albums produced by groups that people never heard of and who record on obscure record labels. And this is what I was saying a second ago. I mean, again, Merciful Fate and Venom, nothing against them as bands. I mean, I'm into a lot of very obscure heavy metal. The point, though, is well taken. Who was listening? I mean, other than, their fans, they weren't a significant, neither one of those bands was really a truly significant player on the scene back then. And that's his point here, is he's saying, look, a lot of the stuff that you're picking out is just this really obscure stuff that really the mainstream of people are not listening to anyway. So let's see here. Radio, quote, "Radio, MTV, and record companies already go through heavy scrutinizing of material," said Meniketti. "You do anything more and you're treading on the First Amendment," unquote. Mars views some parents who want to label records another way. Quote, I would say that they're either being overprotective or selfish and not letting their kids grow up and hear about the world, unquote. He said, quote, "It's kind of ridiculous to shelter kids. The literal guys don't understand the lyrics. The older ones, the ones the parents are trying to protect, will sneak off and listen to it over at their friend's house. It's weird," unquote. So, and that's really it, isn't it? And again, I look at my own situation, and maybe they understood that. I've never really gone into deep discussions with my parents about this. I've asked them or mentioned it to them before, but really, you think about that. You throw away your kids' records, because I know people that their parents did that. Well, what are you going to do? You're going to be mad at your parents, and you're going to go listen to it somewhere else, and then you're going to want it even more. And anyway, like I said, there's this weird sociological thing. And again, I don't want to be too critical of the people at the time, because I wasn't an adult then. I don't know how I would have reacted to all this stuff, and it was all different, and it was scary to some people. So I have to be easy here a little bit on how I respond to that, and try to take my teenage self, my teenage mind out of it that lived through it and knew what I was thinking at the time, because there was a lot of changes happening, and you had a lot of this. You had a lot of people, and you had a lot of this, where you had these guys. This was so crazy and so intense. And it's kind of a funny thing when you start looking at art. Because if this were in a movie, in some sort of horror movie, and these were the bad guys, no one would ever think anything of it. You'd go see the movie and you'd enjoy it and you'd have fun with it and everything. But for some reason, because this was a rock band and it was music and these were lyrics, we treated it differently. We would never, you'd listen to a football game and you'd hear heavy hard rock and music as the bumper music going into commercials, and never even think anything of it. But then if it's coming off of a particular radio station or coming from a guy and you see them and you're hearing it, then all of a sudden it's different. And it's funny, it took us so long to finally put those things in perspective, and then land in a day like today where a band like Metallica, who was really edgy, especially right back at this time, back in 1985, they were on the fringes back then, would get to a point today where they're filling stadiums of what? Families. That's the truth. You have dads and kids and, going to see this stuff because the parents loved music when they were kids, and now they're showing it to their kids, and it's all just kind of okay. But at the time, there was so much change, and it was so difficult for people to deal with. Anyway, I'd love to get your feedback on this, because it was such an interesting time to live through, and to watch what these different groups were doing, and this kind of overprotective nature and this reactionary nature that they had to it, and how much of it was sincere, how much of it was other people on the other side trying to get attention, who knows? And again, it'd be an interesting thing to have to really do a deep dive on this stuff someday, because it was such an interesting time when all of this stuff was happening and there was so much turmoil and tumult. Anyway, hey, thanks for taking the time to watch this video. I really appreciate the great comments that people put on these videos. We have one of the most sophisticated, interesting comment sections. As a matter of fact, most of these videos, I was telling Gary the other day, the guy that's in these videos sometimes, I said, some of these videos really aren't complete until you read the comments, because it's so interesting, the things that people have to say about this stuff. So anyway, we appreciate the comments you make on these videos. Please follow the channel, like the videos, and with that, have yourself a fantastic day.